In terms of the Terra Incognita essay for this issue of the CoreGap report, we were really struck by that Newsweek cover story, Apocalypse Now. There's such a kind of fear-mongering mode going on right now, very much the what can happen next sort of mindset. We thought it was kind of interesting to evoke that 1979 movie, because it really does remind us that we're in another one of these cycles, not unlike the 70s following the 50s and 60s. 50s and 60s very much dominated by superpower, military, nuclear Armageddon concerns, global war, all that kind of stuff. Obviously a security view of the world dominated, and then you get to the 70s and all of a sudden, and we consider the 70s basically to be the first true decade of modern globalization's blossoming, you get to this more complex world where seemingly the security issues don't dominate, at least the great power security issues don't dominate in the way that they did in the previous decades. So a lot of the issues that we focus on today really found their first great expression in the 1970s, the Middle Eastern wars, think back to 1973, environmental disasters like Love Canal, 1978, nuclear disaster, 3 Mile Island, 1979, and the appearance of transnational terrorism, spectacular terrorism, the Munich Olympics in 1972. Even think back to the point where they were warning us in the 1970s about substantial and frightening climate change, except back then they were telling us we were possibly heading towards an ice age. Now, obviously, the focus on global warming. So, like the 70s, what we're coming into now, this decade of the 2010s, we're coming off of the 2000s, very much focused on security, very much focused on great power views and fears about security. Both in the 60s and in the 2000s, America gets involved in a very draining overseas war, Vietnam versus Iraq. And again, you get this kind of mindset of bumping into a lot of complexity and a lot of these apocalyptic now sorts of visions. And yet we would argue if you actually scale back some of this or disaggregate some of this complexity, I mean, the surprise factor here really shouldn't exist in our minds. I mean, the mega disaster of a tsunami plus an earthquake plus a nuclear meltdown in Japan, well, those three are already highly linked. Japan highly depends on nuclear power. It's one of the most seismically active island chains in the world, and tsunami is a Japanese word. So if you're going to put a 40-year-old, very aging, early technology nuclear power plant right on the coast in Japan, I mean, the only mega disaster you're going to get there is going to be an earthquake-triggered, tsunami-delivered nuclear meltdown. So these are not surprising connections. We're just bumping into the connectivity that's natural and only becoming more expansive as globalization advances. Most of the other key situations that we find ourselves bumping into, most of them you can track back to demographics. I mean, if you think about the economic collapse, the housing bubble, that sort of stuff in the West, a lot of these things driven by the aging of the population there, especially as the boomers get ready to retire in the United States. If you look at the Arab revolutions, well, you can talk about a rising middle class in Asia creating all sorts of inflationary pressures just as a youth bulge hits its job seeking time period, and boom, you put together those higher food costs. Young men in Egypt can't get a job, can't get married, and you're looking at political unrest. You could describe China's rise very much in long-term demographic dynamics. I mean, the rise of China, a lot of it due to the fact that its percentage of labor relative to its dependents rose dramatically over the last 30 years, thanks to the one-child policy. And yet, as that one-child policy segues into a rapid aging process because they haven't had enough babies and people are living much longer, you can just as easily predict China's decline over the next 30 years as it adds elders and loses workers relative to dependents. So our point on all this complexity, a lot of it's just revealed connectivity. Most of it has to do with demographics and the choices that we make as humans. These are the most basic elemental choices: marriage, family, children. Most of these things are very slow motion, long-term train wrecks. We bump into them like a man in his late 40s bumps into a middle-age crisis. It's because we don't think about them. It's because we refuse to deal with them. That suddenly they come up and bite us one afternoon, and when they do, we call them black swans, we call them unforeseen events, we call them mega disasters and apocalypse now. But in reality, these are all things that result from the choices that we make collectively, and they're all eminently predictable, which is why you shouldn't get too wrapped up in the current media fixation with disasters.